Welcome back to another episode of Detonation. Here we have two excellent guests, Daniel Hornal, and who is an attorney in the United States, and Ben Zion, regular on the show. He's running for the candidacy to become the president of the United States for the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Glad to have you both on Detonation. Mr. Hornal, we don't know who you are. Detonation people don't know who you are, so who are you? Tell us about your profession and your long line of work, etc.
I'll tell you a few things. So, my name's Daniel. I'm an attorney. I started up a law firm in D.C. right after I graduated from Georgetown about 10 years ago, and ran that for a while. And now I'm back in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and just taking a little bit of time before I start my next venture.
Fantastic. And everyone knows who you are, Ben, but just quickly say who you are and what we're going to be talking about, which is the cornerstone of your platform, which is the Futurist New Deal for America. Ben Zion.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say thank you to Daniel for appearing on this show with me. We've had a lot of conversations. He has a deep understanding of constitutional law, and I had some issues that I wanted to talk about around the Futurist New Deal and the legalities of some of these things, particularly relating to our proposals, a set of proposals for ultimately moving the United States to full votership, as Australia has. And there's a few initiatives that the architects of the Futurist New Deal for America have discussed and worked on and put pen to paper on. And it's good to be able to give these things some airing here on this forum. Yes, as you know, the Futurist New Deal for America is a platform for the Transhumanist Party, and it is a reform ticket around a set of economic reforms. It's a basic income ticket, and also one that's promoting e-governance in various ways, including through iVoting, secured blockchain voting. And we have a number of other anti-corruption measures and pro-democracy measures described here. And all of these are aimed in this, oriented in the same way that that this particular votership concept that we're hoping to discuss today is oriented towards creating a country that is actually a functioning representative government. Outside watchdog agencies sometimes looking at the United States and saying, you kind of have an oligarchy here. You don't necessarily have a functioning democracy anymore to the extent that you once might have, and that's a serious problem. And getting people voting, creating a culture of voting, and creating other incentives of this kind would be one of many steps in the right direction there.
So, Daniel, let's go over quickly what is the current situation in the United States with reference to voting. You're a constitutional lawyer, so how does voting work? Like, a lot of people mix up the fact that it's a democracy and it's a republic, all this sort of stuff. So, what is the legacy idea of voting in the United States?
Well, like just about everything in the United States, there's 50 different answers to that question, 51, because each state does it differently. And each state has authority to set its elections within certain parameters. So, it's sort of a big question to ask, what the structure of the United States is. But basically, we're going to just we'll only talk about right now the federal government. We're going to completely ignore the state government. Each state government, just as a brief aside, they have their own legislature, their own governor. Each one may have a slightly different structure, and they can have elections at different times. And states have authority over a lot of things that you interact with day to day, like roads and police, and that sort of thing. The federal government sets big national policy. For your international listeners, the federal government's the one that matters. They're the ones that control the military, they exercise a lot of control of the economy in general and that sort of thing. So the federal elections are set up. So the state, it's basically set up in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, and what that says is that for electing the U.S. Congress, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators, representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature, which means that each state can decide. But then there's this little thing after that where they wrote, but the Congress may, at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations. So basically, the federal government has almost unlimited power to control how federal elections are held. So there's some other issues we can get to if we talk about specific proposals, but in general, the federal government can do whatever they want, and there's a federal election every 2 years, which is the House of Representatives, and then also there's senators and presidents at different times.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, the states, I think we could probably ignore that for your platform, right, Ben? Because you're not really focused on that. You're focused on federal reformation, right?
This is. Running for president tends to revolve around those concerns. I don't have such strong feelings on states' rights as some people do. I debated Adam Kokesh, one of the first debates that I did with national figure for my podcast, and he has a different view. We might try and have him on the show, I think, but there's certainly the main reforms on the national stage would revolve around these national policies, and certainly the idea of I-voting it would involve some structural changes there. The idea of even these voting incentives would evolve some changes that affect these local bodies as well. So we have to be planning for that and describing that. Certainly, people who worry about these things more at the local level, they want answers. They would want answers to those questions. So I think. Yeah, go ahead.
Daniel, before we just get into this Futurist New Deal and the legal implications of it, can you just explain what is the Electoral College, and do you think there's a lot of talk of abolishment, of rejigging the system? What do you see from your perspective? Is it a legal thing? Is it bad? Is it good? What do you think? What do you see?
It's terrible. You have to keep in mind, the Constitution was written way back in the 1700s, and at that time, you couldn't have a national election on one day and have some sort of centered way to count all the votes and all that sort of thing. And also, when the U.S. was created, it was a union between states, and those states were considered to be, sovereign nations, and wanted to be treated as such and expected to be treated as such. And so, the Electoral College, the idea was that the states, not the people, should be electing the president, right? Because the states, as basically almost like a House of Lords of the United States, it's just a set of sovereigns, each having different sovereign territory. That doesn't make a lot of sense in today's world. The federal government is immensely powerful. We are an integrated nation, and furthermore, there's no technical impediments anymore to just having to, direct election of the president at a popular vote. The Electoral College, I'm not going to get too much into the specifics of it, but basically it greatly distorts the vote in a way that makes somebody in Wyoming, their vote count for something like 10 times or more the vote of somebody in California for president. And it just doesn't make sense. And it wasn't intended that way, and that really wasn't why it was made that way. But that's what happened. So, there are people who will defend it, but the only people who really defend it are the people who have a vested interest in it, which is that it reliably favors certain political parties in certain areas, and so the people who are favored by it, they don't want to change it. But I don't think there's any serious argument that if you were to build a system today, you would do the Electoral College. It's just silly.
Then open up on Electoral College. What do you see? Do you like it as a candidate?
No, I don't. I think that these many states, and it's about it's now this interstate compact that would circumvent the Electoral College is now at something like 80% of it to its critical mass, where it would be effective. I think that's an interesting development. I know that. Yeah. And my feeling is that the world has never really seen direct democracy, and in the 21st century with the prospects of digital democracy, we have that ability. And as Daniel said, we're not seizing the opportunity there because these systems are managed by people with very specific interests. And in the United States, that's particularly so. We have is a very real sense in which we live in the corporatist states of America, and so these systems are being manipulated by people that have no interest in the will of the people or the best outcomes for the people, or very, very little interest, and that affects the pace of digitalization in governance in a very real way.
Ben, while you're talking, open the floor on your iVoting. Open your floor on iVoting. Segue there.
It's funny that you mentioned that. There is a feature. It's perhaps the number 2 pillar of the Futurist New Deal for America. Is iVoting, blockchain secured voting, and this is a system. I spoke to an emissary from Estonian e-governance, Florian Marcus, at some length in a podcast on this, and this is an implementable system. Other countries are doing this. Again, we just have to have the political will. The United States has Silicon Valley, the envy of every nation in terms of these capacities. We have to have the political will to implement them in this particular area around governance. And if we do, we could do this in short order. I am somebody who identifies as a left libertarian, and I see iVoting and e-governance measures generally as the shortest distance between the systems that we have that are more centralized and things that are more decentralized. A digital democracy necessarily leads to a level of decentralization, more of a representation, and other features which I think are stepping stones to a more voluntarist society. I note that many libertarians, whom I would call right libertarians, are focused on other matters, and those matters are not always initiatives. They're not always policy notions. They're ideological matters around taxes and so forth. It's a bit like spitting into the wind, rather than coming up with policy proposals that would advance these aims.
Yeah. So Daniel, what do you think of iVoting, this electronic voting stuff that's coming out? Do you think it's constitutionally compatible?
I don't see a problem with it. Again, the U.S. Constitution section I read to you earlier said the Congress may at any time make or prescribe, alter such regulations, meaning regulations on voting for federal office. So I don't see a problem with it at all. There's some other proposals out there floating around that could have some issues, but this one seems pretty straightforward. It's just it's like Ben said, it's a question of political will. And it's a matter of, you have to convince people that it's a good idea, why it's a good idea, and then, take over the Congress and get it passed.
Yeah. What's the numbers that you would have to get to pass a bill like this through Congress?
Oh, just a majority. So you just have to have majority of the House, majority of the Senate, and then the president to sign it. Just like any other bill. It's nothing constitutional, nothing complicated.
Okay, cool. Yeah, understood. Ben, go on.
We should say that in the long term, this kind of digitalization, it costs pennies on the dollar. We already have the effective portals for things like this. In Estonia, they have a two-factor security system around this. People are about 50% of the population now in this country. People are using other means, but 50% are voting from their desktop and then verifying their vote from their phone, and that makes it very safe because it's very difficult for any number of people to be hacked through both of those channels. So there's very little fraud and very little security concerns. They've had this system effectively for 14 years, and they have not had any serious push to reform or recall this. And more people are voting, and more people are voting via this means, and it represents a reduction in costs at the local levels. It would represent that to a great degree in the United States. And moreover, the concerns in the United States, people always want to point to some Macedonian or Nigerian hacker or some other more nefarious espionage going on. Those are very real concerns. But in the United States, the concern is largely that political leaders and lobbies are really muddying our voting system in a lot of ways. There's all manner of voter suppression going on. There's a very real sense in which the voting machines that we use and even the paper ballots, there's a tendency to stuff the ballot box or burn the ballot box to narrow partisan ends rather than and that's a lot harder to do when you have this level of transparency and this level of cooperation and digitalization that would be occurring with an iVoting system.
Daniel, regardless of where you stand on this issue, in the United Kingdom, they had a vote. It was for Brexit. It passed. And now they're sort of stumbling on implementing Brexit. And a lot of the quote unquote Remainers are saying, well, if we have another vote today, the vote would be different. Now, where do you think that's okay that you can change the vote of an outcome of something that big? And in the United States, is that possible, like to sort of change it? And would it be possible to, if you implemented an e-voting system, change your vote up to the election day? So if there was a voting week and you said, oh, I'm voting Trump today, actually I changed my mind 3 days out, I'm going to vote Hillary and change. Is that okay?
That's a couple questions. So first of all, your first question is a real interesting one because it's a philosophical question, and it's a question of pre-commitment, right? In any case, if I might today think that it's a good idea for me to take out a $10,000 or $100,000 loan and buy a brand new, extremely nice sports car, but me in a month probably wouldn't consent to that decision when I first got the first payment, right? And who do we want to privilege? And that's a problem, inherent in all democracies. So to answer sort of the technical side of your question, yes, that can happen in the United States. Just as a funny example, since I'm here in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, Seattle has a monorail. And it's the only place in the country that's got a monorail in the Disneyland, as far as I know. And the people loved it, and so they really just wanted to have like a citywide monorail system. And Seattle allows ballot initiatives, so somebody put this on the ballot, monorail. We're going to do a monorail, and then it passed. And then a few years later, they came with the specific plan, and they put that on the ballot. Here's our plan for the monorail. It passed. And then a year or two later, there was some problem at the agency and some people in the city who really didn't like the idea of the monorail. They wanted to have a traditional light rail system. That may have made more sense, but it's not as cool. They opposed it, and they tried to get this thing on the ballot, and then the people again voted yes, monorail. We want a monorail. We're serious. So this was about 15 years ago. There's still no monorail. Like the little 1 mile line that was there when they built in the 1960s, the only monorail that's still there. And what happened was the 5th time they put it up for a vote, it was finally defeated and never came back. And that's a problem. It's sort of it's a problem. It sounds like it's ugly. And in that particular situation, I was really annoyed about it. But at the same time, it's like, you can do that as a person too. A person can act like a state. So as a person, you can say, okay, today I want this, tomorrow I want this. But in a month, if I don't want it anymore, I can just not do that thing anymore. I can change my mind. So you can always do that. As far as for a voting system, if you could have people change their votes, that's a funny idea. I would think that would probably be a bad feature to put in there, just because it starts to make things more complicated. And every time you have an additional complication, you have an additional vector for an attack, additional amount of confusion. What if somebody holds somebody at gunpoint and says, change your vote? I mean, I don't know. That seems pretty unlikely, but it's, I don't know. And to me, it seems like you probably wouldn't want to do that. But that's just my opinion. That's not a legal question.
Then Zion, would you allow for vote changing?
Yeah, up to the end of the election period. That is a feature of the present Estonian iVoting system, and they haven't had a terrible amount of trouble with it. but there's always going to be concerns with manipulation of this kind. And we should say of the kind of things that we're talking about in Brexit, this is very much an action of master manipulators, professional astroturfers, people like Steve Bannon that have access to botnets and all manner of organizations that are happy to kind of stack the deck a little bit on things like this. And so that's not a feature of real choice, in my view, when you have these kind of organizations. And, you know, this came up in a conversation a few days ago about a gentleman named Peter Thiel, who is a billionaire, and he is kind of someone in the transhumanist community. He's a life extensionist, and he's devoted some millions of dollars to research for life extension. But he's also somebody who has an organization called Palantir, a little bit like one of these master manipulator type organizations, and he influenced very much the 2016 election. He's influenced these kind of things to these corporatist and narrow partisan ends. We could be using these kinds of things to advance public health aims. Someone like that who is devoted to that, I would hope would be doing that more, rather than just using it to make sure that his tax rate remains relatively low. So it is a serious problem. These kinds of organizations, but we would hope that we are moving. You know, Mark Zuckerberg would say that this is a blip on the radar. That he's got ways to fix these kind of problems, and that we're going to be moving more and more towards a situation where digitalization creates greater transparency, advanced algorithms can address these concerns, and everybody wins. So hopefully that's the case with the manipulation of iVoting, which thus far has not been a serious problem compared to voting machines, which are the problems are pretty tremendous.
Yeah, and a lot of those problems stem back to the corporations that build the machines. So one of the ways to battle against this is decentralization and blockchain technology. Now, if you're a voter out there and you don't know what either of these two words mean, that sounds pretty scary. Why would I enter the trustless economy? Ben, why is decentralization and the blockchain part of your e-voting method?
Yes. Well, you know, I interviewed a gentleman named Max Kay, also from your country, who's the founder of the Flux International Party and Flux Australia. And, you know, it was the first time when I'd heard the description of some of these systems in detail, how they would actually work. And, you know, you pointed out one simple example was that in a country of your size, which is admittedly smaller than the United States, we could have all of this information effectively being managed from one MacBook. Now, the system, the algorithms themselves, that's a bit of infrastructure and investment beyond that. But the system could be managed through with relatively little hardware, and that's an important feature. This has incredible implications for other disciplines and other aspects of civil society, as we are able to be enhancing digitalization in other fields. We will see a lot of payoffs as we're seeing these things costing these systems beginning to cost pennies on the dollar compared to the bricks and mortar and 20th century models. The best example, again, goes back to a few conversations and via podcasts that I've had, including with the gentleman I mentioned, Florian Marcus, because they've enhanced e-governance portals to such a degree throughout their systems. They are now in a position to begin using blockchain medicine and having big data having a role in their public health service. And this will, I believe, in very short order, in countries that are first adopters of this, begin to lead to a system where we have constant monitoring of citizens and in terms of their health, a good kind of monitoring. And this will lead also to a system that is focused on prevention and early interventions for disease, driving down the cost of public health significantly, and also setting the stage for much longer lifespans, a concern that is essential to people in the transhumanist community specifically.
Daniel, you're an attorney and you know a lot about the old Constitution. The old voting system that we're talking about, which exists today, is a sort of centralized command and control system. He's talking about here making it a decentralized, sort of democratized system. Does it work? Are the people too afraid? Would the government buy it? Is it unconstitutional?
It's not unconstitutional. That's the only question I can tell you for sure, and that's, you know, when I tell you that, of course, you know, you could probably find a lawyer somewhere who disagree with me, but I think it's pretty clear in the Constitution that that'd be fine. You know, I personally don't mind spending a little money on elections. To me, the arguments about, you know, cost, at least in the United States, you know, we waste so much money on so many things that have zero importance. You know, if we have to spend $1 billion a year on an election, if we get it right, I don't care. I just want us to get it right. That's the most important thing for me. Yeah. And as far as I personally, you know, I've been spending a lot of time recently with my parents, and they're a little older, and very, very technically savvy people in general, I would say, as far as that goes. But even them, you know, I wouldn't ask my mom to trust being able to vote on her phone. You know, it would be important to me, whatever happens, you know, whatever the system is that it turns out, I think it has to be an option for people to go in with a piece of paper and a pencil and put it in a box. And, you know, and then the system right now in America, at least where they're still using manual voting, is that you can observe the whole process. You know, I personally think that the system that in this New Deal, the Futurist New Deal, is far superior than the system which is used in a lot of states now, which is using electronic voting, already has all these attack vectors, but doesn't have the safety side of it through the blockchain. That, like, it's not observable, it's not really auditable, and that's a serious problem. For me, you can either do it the Futurist New Deal way, or you can do it with a you know, paper and pencil, you know, or some combination of the two. But there needs to be a change. It needs to be something that can be, you know, audited and observed and tested. And that's, I think, a big problem with the current system now. Is it's just right now it's impossible to audit it in some of these places. There's no paper trail. There's no blockchain trail. There's nothing.
I have a comment. I have a question to ask you, Ben. But did you want to respond to any of that?
Sure. Well, one thing, there's been a little bit of confusion from people about the idea of iVoting being mandated in every state. It would not be a requirement where every person would be required to vote in this manner, but rather that every state would have this portal available in the way that Estonia now has 50% of voters using this. The other 50% are basically getting together with their friends in a sort of pageantry that has gone back many decades to enjoy going to their voting booth and actually voting and filling out the forms. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you can think of this in terms of even, you know, a disease vector. Again, I like to use this example. Even a small amount of increased transparency could really break up some of those channels of corruption in the system. And that corruption is very real. You know, Daniel mentioned a few moments ago the value of spending on public elections. And the United States doesn't have a public election system of this kind at the federal level. We have something that's very much privately funded. There's a lot of dark money. And that's when people talk about these big numbers, and sometimes people using that kind of defraying of costs on the part of those spenders as a justification for this. But that leads to an incredible amount of corruption. Countries that have publicly funded elections, they don't deal with the kinds of problems that we do. They don't have outside watchdog agencies looking at their country and saying, Sorry, pal, that's not really a democracy.
Ben, so Daniel brought up an incredible point where he said, he wouldn't, his parents are tech savvy, but do you worry about the fact that there's a digital divide where you would be dividing up the country, where the people who can use the smartphones and use this technology are able to vote, and the people who can't read or can't do that can't vote, or don't have the access or the means? Would there still be this sort of democratized location system, which is Daniel's talking about, how people have to go into the voting space and participate either in pen or electronic form?
Well, this problem is far worse right now, and it's far worse because we don't have a national holiday for voting. It's far worse because we have all manner of voter suppression methods that tend to split along socioeconomic lines and disadvantaging many communities as a result. That's the most serious concern here. Now, in the United States, an awful lot of people, basically 90% of people have either a smartphone or access to broadband internet. And those remaining 10% of people, particularly rather low-income people, they would also theoretically have access to a smartphone via a program called the Lifeline program, wherein they could get a free smartphone if they are not able to afford one for themselves. So they could theoretically be voting from this as well. So I don't think we would see a system that would be contributing in any real way to this digital divide. I think what would be happening is you would have just a lot more voter turnout. It's pretty common in midterm elections to have a 25 or 30% voter turnout of eligible voters. That's a pretty serious problem there. And whatever we can do to get those numbers up, it will have broad effects on the corruption that we see in the United States in other areas.
Yeah, can I just tell a quick story? I was doing election protection back in 2008. So this is back when I was in law school, and we all went down to the Democrats. We went down to these different precincts, and we basically just sat there and watched the polls. And if somebody couldn't vote or had trouble voting, they'd come to us, and we could call somebody and try to help them. Anyway, I'm there, and I got there at 6 in the morning, and by the time the polls opened, there was about an hour and a half long line, because all these folks in this poor community, majority African American in Norfolk, Virginia. These were people who, really wanted their chance to vote, but they had to work. These are just regular working people. And we lost quite a few people who just got out of that line and went to work. So if we're talking about voter suppression, right, that's like, you can say, I absolutely agree with Ben on this. You can say that given these people this option, you could leave some people behind, and I do strongly believe that it needs to be optional, and it needs to be something that older people can still participate in their own way. But if I had been able to say, okay, here, just install this app, log in with your universal government login, the same login that you use to get to your benefits, the same login you get for Social Security. You could do all this with one single universal login. This could be easy. Here, just install this app, and here's how you vote. And these people would have had the chance to cast a vote. And I think that's really important. I think that anything that's going to increase the options is going to be overall a win for regular working people, the kind of people who don't have time to stand in line for an hour and a half before work in the morning.
Daniel, that was going to be my next question. Was this Trump's pushing for this voter ID card? What do you think of the voter ID? And you mentioned a government ID login system. Well, what combine the two? What do you think?
Well, so a universal login is sort of a different idea, and I haven't, I've never talked to Ben about this before. It's just a hobby horse of my own. But basically, but other people have talked about it, and it's just an idea of, you have your just like you could use your Google password to log in anywhere. You have one thing you can log into anything in the government, and this is your ID. It's simple. It's easy. You could get official notices through it, whatever. But regardless of that, as far as
voter ID, Trump's
voter ID. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, that is extremely stupid. there is, okay, we got to look at this scientifically. An election is a vote where we have to count up, say, 40, 50 million, 100 million different, entries into a database, if you will, right? Just we have to count all these 100 million different things. That counting is not perfect. In any system in the world, it doesn't matter if it's this or whatever, it's possible for somebody to accidentally push the wrong thing and then not really look at the confirmation, and then they voted for the wrong people. You have inaccuracies built into the system. In 2000, when Bush got selected in Florida, we very much saw that. Right? There are errors in any system. The amount of people who go in person, say they're somebody that they're not, to get a ballot and vote is vanishingly small, right? How many people, how hard would it be to flip an election by hiring people to go in and pretend they're somebody else and commit a felony, an in-person felony, right? And if they happen to go to the polling places in the neighborhood of somebody, oh, that's not Cheryl, they'll say, right? You can't go and pretend to be Cheryl if you're not Cheryl. It's not going to work. The purpose of those laws is, like I said at the very beginning, right? There's people who have vested interest in certain outcomes, and it is well known that people who are poorer, people who are younger, people who are a little less sophisticated as far as economically are less likely to have ID, and they're more likely to, oh shoot, I'm going to work, I forgot my wallet at home. Okay, well I don't have time to go home and then come back, I have to go to work, so then they just don't vote, right? The voter ID is targeted at people for whom it is inconvenient to have an ID. You might not have an ID, or if you forget it, it's a problem. In other words, it's targeted at people who are on the left of the spectrum. And that's why Trump is pushing it. That's the only reason Trump is pushing it. That's the only reason the Republicans have ever wanted it, is because it's election reform that helps them, eliminate voters that are less likely to vote for them. Simple as that.
Do you have provisions to battle against voter ID or implement voter ID in the Futurist New Deal, Ben?
Yes. We would be going by something similar to the Estonian model. So Estonia does have voter ID and associated portals and government services that are accessed through this one kind of identity, the kind of thing that Daniel first mentioned, and that's a very different initiative from what is effectively a voter suppression. Chris Kobach is sort of the voter suppression czar in the Trump administration was, and this is a guy who's made all manner of efforts to disenfranchise different communities and nullifying of voter registrations and all of this kind of thing. This is a strategy to prop up Republican Party and the white power structure in the United States artificially in a diminishing demographic circumstances. Every Republican basically has these talking points about concerns about voter fraud. They're not real concerns, and insofar as I would support any of those kinds of things about voter ID, it would be towards building the kinds of fully articulated portals that we would talk about, a national ID system for everyone that allows a greater access to government services, and not some tool of cynics to try and manipulate individual elections to one particular partisan end.
So would you would make this compulsory? Is that a fine? Is it jail time? Is it how does that work?
Yeah, no fines, no jail time under any circumstance. The Futurist New Deal is a broad decriminalization set of efforts. So there would not be penalties of this kind, but it would be a little bit like the e-voting thing. People would have access to that. The extent to which they would use it is their choice, but they would have access to that secured identity and portal. Just in the way that everyone has a Social Security number. The extent to which they're using it for this or that undertaking is up to them. Um, yeah, we would definitely want to allow people to retain their own decision making on personal matters, but we want to just have the ability to use this technology in more artful ways.
Yeah, because in Australia here, it's not only compulsory, but you would get a fine if you don't vote. So that's kind of interesting. Sorry, Daniel.
But it hasn't.
Oh, I didn't have anything to say about that.
Oh, sorry. Who was speaking? I didn't.
But you haven't been. It hasn't been some slippery slope into a loss of personal freedoms as a result of this system that you've had for many decades. It's just allowed a functioning of representative government to be a little operating a little bit more efficiently. Is that your take on the Australian system?
Well, the population is so small, and voting is such a it's such a cultural so culturally ingrained with who we are. And the other thing is, like, on a really sort of base comedic level, Australians are such whingers that, you know, they sort of make them vote and then say, haha, it's your fault that you elected us, sort of thing. So, you know, you can't, you know, it's kind of true too. Yeah, we are the world's biggest whingers. So, yeah, so that's kind of cool. So what else is there in the platform there that you like, Ben, that you have in the Futurist New Deal that you might?
There's a few initiatives that we talked about. Now, here in Arizona, where I live, about 13 years ago, there was a ballot initiative that was defeated, and it was something designed to create interest and excitement around voting, and it was a $1 million prize, basically a lottery, that would be randomly given to a voter for each election, and it was pretty popular. It did get about 35% of the vote, that initiative. So it was something that could have reasonably been passed. But I don't see any problem with creating a greater interest in voter participation and the running of government more generally. Just as I don't see a serious problem with the way that the blogosphere has evolved in the last decade. That has created greater interest and participation in these things in an ancillary way. I think that's a healthy thing. There's unhealthy aspects of it. But the initiative that we have here in the Futurist New Deal is an initiative wherein young voters turning 18, were they to participate in their first election that they were able to vote in, would receive a tax credit of $100 for voting, and all other voters, if they voted in the general election, if they voted in all elections, basically, at least the midterm and general election, they would be receiving this credit as well. So basically, be receiving this credit every 4 years. This would not dramatically reduce federal tax revenues, but it would. Like a public voting system versus the dark money system that we have today, it would dramatically enhance good outcomes for policymaking and trust in these institutions.
Daniel, do you like that idea?
Yeah, I do. I think that's it's great. And, you know, when we're talking about increasing voter turnout, I think it's also important, you know. The reason that it's gotten so bad in the United States, at least in previous elections, I think is, you know, people haven't been terribly excited about anybody who's running, and they haven't heard anything new. So, you know, I think that's the real trick is, you know, we can come up with these policies, but you have to have something that people have to have a reason to come out and vote and be inspired. And I hope that's what's going to be changing soon as well.
You're not worried of linking bank accounts to voting, so you're not worried that there might be a security breach there and that there might be identity implications.
No, I mean, you can already. I think you can already get your Social Security direct deposited. That's all we're talking about. That doesn't seem like a problem to me. If it were me designing the system, I would say if you come vote in person, if you're gonna give an incentive to vote, you just give them a $25 gift card when they walk out. But if you could do it by direct deposit, you could do it you could do it Venmo. It doesn't matter. That's not going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Ben, you're not worried about that either?
No, I mean, people often point to these security issues, but we have Amazon, which has 1 billion plus users who are pretty happy with the level of security that there's always concerns, but they're pretty happy with the level of security. They're happy enough that more and more users are adapting this kind of system. No, I'm not too concerned about that. There are always going to be incidents of fraud, but I cannot imagine that it would be like Daniel said, it would be the kind of integration that would just be an extension of systems that already exist, and people would have other options. They could have a paper option of receiving just receiving a check in the mail or receiving a gift card, something like that.
Anything else about the platform that you want to talk about, Ben?
Well, there are other questions of the of constitutionality that I guess we could get to, and if we don't necessarily have to go into a deep dive on this. So the Futurist New Deal, the major pillar of the Futurist New Deal is a middle class basic income, a $52,000 basic income that is paid for from a federal land dividend, which would generate about $173 trillion over the course of 10 years by leasing out these 85% of federal lands that are not national parks to carbon neutral corporations and organizations. Now, the particular question around that, there's a lot of tax restructures that would have to be implemented for something like this to take place. And one feature of this tax restructure is a 20% corporate tax rate that would remove a lot of the loopholes and manipulations. Right now our tax code is basically two tax codes, one for working people and one for wealthy people and corporations that are able to game the system to a high degree. The tax code is written in arcane language to allow for this kind of treachery. And we need to reduce that, and this relatively low corporate tax rate is a kind of a concession to a diversity of opinions in the transhumanist community. But the concern, I guess, here in the constitutional concern is that we would want to make some metadata and other information from corporate tax returns public under the Freedom of Information Act. To make it more difficult to be gaming the system in these ways. This is a systematic problem that we have here. So it's a question of whether what the legalities around something like that would be. I would be curious to hear Daniel's thoughts on that.
That's a really interesting question, and not something I thought of or thought about. So I don't see. It's okay. The only thing you could run into when you're talking about disclosure of information is you'd have to violate some basic fundamental right in the Constitution. The only one I can think of that would even come close would be the First Amendment right to association and right to speech. But generally that's not been, I've never heard that interpreted in such a way, the right to free speech, that mandatory disclosure of private information would run afoul of that amendment. So that doesn't seem like a problem. There could be, if you really wanted to stretch it, if I was a Supreme Court justice and I was like, how could I make this illegal? What excuse could I come up with? Now, maybe you could say something about if you had to disclose certain business relationships, that could have some effect on the right to assembly. So the analogous case about this was a case back in the 50s where the NAACP in some southern state, I can't remember which one, was being forced by the state government to disclose its member list. which, as you might imagine, the 50s in the South was not for was for nefarious purposes. And the court actually held that the NAACP could keep that private, and the reason was because it was going to fundamentally interfere with their right to petition the government for grievances, right? Again, this is a anti-segregationist group. It'd be a real stretch to try to apply that sort of critical government interest of like being able to lobby the government and to say, oh, well, if we find out that Enron has contracts with, Halliburton and somebody else, I don't see that being a problem. But playing devil's advocate, if you wanted to try to make it unconstitutional, you could try it that way. I would say that, in any platform, I don't care what party you're running for, who wins the nomination, you're going to have a Supreme Court that's going to at least be operating in good faith, which means you're going to have to get at least one more seat on that Supreme Court changed, because right now it's, there's a problem of, there's a perceived problem of legitimacy, and it may be a real problem of, people sort of, and this has happened before, where the court, people in the court will, make decisions seemingly more based on preferential policy than sort of any idea of law. That's always a danger. But I think that for something like what you just described, I think you'd be totally fine. And I think it's actually a fantastic idea to have, more disclosure. Even any economist will say that, you can only be efficient if you have good information. You can't build an efficient economy without good information. So why not make that public? I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and we should say that the function of something like this is not to make it harder for companies to maintain basic trade secrets or avoid corporate espionage, but just to have a basic level of metadata about a company's finances, so that they're not able to operate in complete secrecy and be hiding what is a net of trillions of dollars offshore, and this sort of thing. And there's a fine line that can be walked there with putting this information out there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right, cool. Well, if that's all you've got to go, then we'll start to wrap it up. But hey, thank you very much for coming on Dead Nation, Daniel Hornal and Ben Zion. That's really good. Thanks for walking through the New Deal. Daniel, I wanted to ask you. Brett Kavanaugh's on there. I was going to ask you about the Supreme Court. Brett Kavanaugh's been pushed on there. It's going conservative. If Trump gets in, where do you see the Supreme Court going in the next 50 years? Do you think, or the next 10 years? I mean, it seems like it's pushing more conservative right now, but is that momentum going to keep up?
Well, so it's hard to say. So first of all, ultimately, the seats on the Supreme Court are controlled by the political branches, and that they get to decide who goes on. Right now, there's definitely a solid conservative majority, as a couple of members of which are almost bordering on reactionary. But there's more interest than just conservative and liberal, or conservative and left, or however you want to phrase it. We think about politics on this spectrum. But take Roberts, for example. He's a very interesting guy. He's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he's definitely a conservative. He's well to the right of I suspect anybody here, although I couldn't say specifically to you. I think that he has voted that way. However, he's also an institutionalist, meaning that he believes that it is important for the court to have power in the United States. And the funny thing about the Constitution is that it says the court is this, final, highest court in the land, final judicial arbiter of everything, but it gave them no army, gave them no police force, right? They only have their sort of respectability and their trust. The only reason they have any power at all. So, there is some talk that, for example, when the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was upheld by the Supreme Court with Roberts voting with the liberals, It was not, it was, and he did it in sort of a weird legal way that I don't want to, bore your audience with, but it was strange. But the reason he may have done that was because he thought that this was this tremendously popular program by a new president who had a large mandate. This was a decision, a legal question that had never been asked before, and to just immediately shut it down, I think it's likely that he thought it would be a problem for the court in the future. And if you go back in time far enough, the federal government has not always obeyed the court. I think it was Andrew Jackson who
the Fed
was he once said something like, okay, the court has made its ruling, now let it enforce it, and just ignored it. And this was like a ruling in favor of Native Americans who he did not much like and he really wanted to slaughter, and he just kept doing it because he didn't care what the court said. That could happen again. And all it would take would be the president saying, this is nakedly political, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have the right to decide this, so go away. And so I think that you're going to see the court, for the next few years, it's going to be a pretty right-wing court. What if you have and they're going to, at the margins, keep kind of chipping away at progressive legislation in probably a pretty harmful way, but there's only so far they can go. And the other thing to keep in mind is that as soon as you get a liberal majority or a left majority or a transhumanist majority or whatever you happen to get on that court, you're going to the court's going to have the opportunity to undo everything it did. So the court can say something that's unconstitutional today and says it's constitutional tomorrow, and that can happen, simply by changing the math. So I think that overall, I suspect the court's probably, if you ask my opinion where it's going to go in the next 10 years to try to really answer your question, I think it's maybe about done with its rightward. I don't think it's going to go much further to the right. If Trump wins a re-election, it could, but it's probably not going to go too much further to the right because it's kind of hitting the limits of its own institutional political power to go to the right. And I suspect it's going to probably swing back. The court has always been a right-wing institution in the United States. There's maybe 20 years, the Warren Court in the United States in the 60s, where the court was centrist to center-left. But other than that, the entire history of the United States, it's been right. And I would expect that to generally, it's going to continue to be a right-wing influence. But I don't think it's, there are people who are saying everything's over, you might as well just burn the country down. And they might be right about the burning the country down, but not because of the court. The court is something that I think we can overcome.
Another question I have for you is we talk a lot on this show about the exponential curve, so the increasing rate of society and technology and other things. Do you think that the court is going to become more important in making decisions in America and on the world? Is there going to be a backlog? Is there going to be a backlog of sort of work for them as they become more and more important as these technologies and society speeds up even more, or is the current system with its tier of courts it's going to be able to handle the amount of rapid change in our civilization?
Okay, well, I'll answer your question in two parts. Part number one, most people in the judicial, almost everybody in the judicial field right now agrees that the federal court system is overburdened and is overworked. You have so the way it works in the United States, you have the district courts, they do the trials. There's at least one district in every state. Some states have many districts, like California has 4. And then you have the circuit courts, and these are the appellate courts. So if you lose the district court, you go to the appeals court, and then of all the circuits, it goes to this. If you appeal from there, you can go to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court doesn't have to take your case. The Supreme Court only takes the cases it wants to take, and what it'll do is it basically waits for a case to come from a circuit court where it says, oh, this is going to be a big deal to a lot of people. This is going to make a big influence across the entire judicial system if we say this is the rule, so this is the case we're going to take. And I think that system is fine. That's probably going to be okay. I think we need more circuits, and we need to break up the Ninth Circuit. There's no question we need to break up the Ninth Circuit into several circuits. But I think that it's going to be okay as far as the workload. Now, I will say, as society becomes more complex, they won't be able to keep their fingers in all the pies. And this has already happened, right? The Supreme Court, they hear like 100 cases a year or less, and there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cases filed, right? And as you have new laws, new areas of regulation, if you have an expanding state that is doing more things, the Supreme Court's not going to be able to keep up. But that's just kind of I don't know. I don't think it's really an insight. I think that's just because that's what happens as it gets more complex. It's harder to manage.
So there's Zoltan Itzvan. Oh, sorry, just one sec, Ben. So Zoltan Itzvan wrote an article, for example. He was talking about how incubators essentially will start to eliminate the abortion issue, but the Supreme Court has got itself so, through the Hippocratic Oath and through Roe v. Wade and other things, it's got itself so entangled with this issue. As these issues might become, non-issues in the future, do you think that will impact? Do you think that the court will be able to keep up with the times on issues that it's become so embroiled in?
I think the court the court will have great difficulty adopting to change, technological change. It already has. I mean, look at what the court has done with copyright in the United States. It's insane. It's not malice. They just don't know what they're doing. They don't understand the new world. There's this wonderful talk by Larry Solomon back from I want to say 2008 about the how in the digital world everything is a copy, right? Right now, my screen is copying your screen. Your screen is being copied out to everybody else. But also just the very fact of looking at something, downloading something from the web, well, that makes a copy. So then all of a sudden, copyright law goes from this really narrow area where you're just talking about copying literal books, like making copies and physical copies, and all of a sudden, like, oh, if I just show this to you, hey Ben, if I show you this link, I have made a copy. Copyright law is suddenly implied, right? And so the court was totally unprepared for this, and it's actually remarkable how well it's worked out for everybody. But even now, you still see it like with these. With content creators, having problems with getting copyright claims all the time. All this, this structure was created to sort of in response to these brand new legal problems, where you have these old laws and you try to apply them to new things, and it just doesn't work. It's extremely difficult, and I don't suspect the court's going to do well. And I think that what you really need to have is an intelligent legislature, an intelligent president, who's like, who's making the rules, and then the court can just say, okay, that's fine, as opposed to asking the court to apply old rules to new situations. That's where it gets really tough.
So this is, sorry Ben, I'm holding you off here, but this is the other thing I was gonna ask you about. Every group in America argues that their guy, whether it's the president or someone going to an esteemed position such as a Supreme Court justice, should have had a background in X. So if you're a Christian, you say you should have been a pastor before he became, or if you're a scientist, you say you should have a science degree before he becomes a president, or if you're in the military, you say should have been a general before you're allowed to become the president. Do you see, for example, in the science realm, with science becoming such an influential factor in society, do you think that outside of law that these these Supreme Court justices and or judges or anything should have another background, be that computers, be that it's the old one, but is just being a lawyer or just being caught in the litigious sort of loop just going to be enough in the future?
I mean, I don't think so. Most politicians have been lawyers, and that hasn't necessarily worked out so well. You need a more varied background. On the other hand, George W. Bush was our first non-lawyer president. He had a business degree, an MBA, and I think his record's pretty clear, and it is a remarkable set of failures, just moral and economic and everything else. So. That being said, I think it would be useful for people. Let's put it this way. So judges make these decisions they see each other at, like, on the court. There's 9 of them. They see each other as peers. Then they have working for them. Each of them has a number of clerks. These clerks tend to be law students, or not law students, but recent law graduates. These clerks do all the actual research. They write some of the opinions. When you see a judge's opinion, by the way, the judge often didn't write it. At the Supreme Court level, I'm not going to say who's writing their opinions, who's not. Whatever. It's like, that's sort of like, rumor mill in the legal profession. Like, oh, that doesn't sound like Kagan. I bet you that was her clerk. But I think that you want to have clerks who know things. That's certainly useful. I think it would be tremendously useful if somebody on the court was appointed because they, who did have a very strong background in tech, who could explain encryption to these people, who could explain. I think that would be great. The problem is that people get selected for the Supreme Court because the people who voted, who want them to be there, think they're going to be politically reliable and do what they want them to do once they get in. And that seems to be, important. And it's hard to sort of, if you could probably count on one hand the number of people who are, among the top 0.1% of legal scholars and also have a master's degree in computer science or physics. Right, and so it's just, I think it's a great question, and I would love to see more influence of that. And I think, and there's historical precedent for this. In the history of the country, we've had Supreme Court justices who's never gone to law school and who have no law degree. It's happened before, 100 years ago, but it's happened. Maybe one of the 9, or maybe we'll increase it. We'll make it 12. One of the 12, or one of the 15. However many want. Maybe they should be a scientist. Maybe they should be a teacher.
Understood.
There probably should be somebody who works at a labor union too.
So Ben, I've been holding you off.
No, that's quite all right. And I recently did 2 interviews with leaders of the technocracy movement, the Technocracy Party, a august organization going back about a century. And they've had this mandate for quite some time. It's not been heeded by everyone else, but this idea that engineering principles and scientism should be more an organizing principle of governance and civil society. And they have a lot of other more detailed kinds of initiatives along those lines that they've worked towards. But yeah, I think that it's kind of unfortunate that we don't have that as a part of what we're doing, and it leads to things, where we have this kind of a gap. Daniel was talking a moment ago about how intellectual property, the potentials, present day potentials, and realities of how intellectual property is used are not reflected by the laws. I think that one of the first bad signs of that was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And problems that derive from that, and many kind of initiatives since. So we have a big gap there. Earlier in that discussion, this idea of the automation of legal services and advanced algorithms being able to maybe allow the Supreme Court to be hearing, or courts in general, to be hearing more cases, allowing other features of the legal system to be doing things that they haven't been able to do for a lack of man hours. So in that sense, I think this sort of robot apocalypse that's described sometimes in the same breath as a transhumanist party would be a very good thing for these systems, allowing them to do a lot more work that they haven't quite been able to do just because of structural limitations. And so, yeah, that has exciting implications for, I think, legal fields. But before that, we were talking a little bit about the Supreme Court itself and the historical trajectory of that. I would like to say that these whatever the differences between someone like John Roberts on the rightward side of the spectrum and Brett Kavanaugh, half of these individuals on this court were put there by presidents who were not elected by the popular vote. And this is a feature of this failings that we've described in voter suppression generally and of the Electoral College. All of these things need to be rectified. So the idea that there is a political will for this kind of conservatism in this organization, had we not had this kind of manipulation, we might have a court more like the Warren Court that Daniel described today. So there's an awful lot of areas of concern here that I think that are addressed. Techno Progress has a way of making things more transparent, making things more user-friendly, making all of us able to have a better control of our lives. And the extent to which we're willing to recognize that and embrace that, we really do improve the quality of our civil society in doing so.
Yeah, I see the local, what you call county courts in America, as just simple dispute resolution. So I see AI knocking a lot of that work out very quickly. So yeah, but anyway, that should wrap it up. We should wrap it up there, so everyone can go. You can go and enjoy the rest of the fleeting day there. I see that the sun's almost gone.
We're getting bad.
So you should go and enjoy that, and Ben, you should get some sleep. I don't know, but anyway, thank you so much for coming on Detonation.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thanks again, Ben, for organizing such a wonderful event.
Yeah, anytime. Let's do it again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right.